Sometimes when people get involved with a Unitarian Universalist congregation and they get interested in joining, they'll ask me if they need to convert. You know, is there some kind of conversion? And I say, no, that's not what we do. You know, if you're Jewish and you have a Jewish identity, you don't have to not be Jewish to be Unitarian Universalist or Muslim or whatever it is. And it has occurred to me lately that perhaps I have been answering that question incorrectly. Perhaps I haven't given it enough thought. And so I started to think about it a little more. That word convert actually means to change, to change religions. So you are changing from being Jewish to being Unitarian Universalist or etc. And we are not invested in that as Unitarian Universalists at all. But we also have to remember that so much of religious identity is tied to family identity and ethnic identity. I'm a Unitarian Universalist and a Jesus girl, but I'm a Weinstein. So there is part of, there's always going to be the connection to Jewish life and identity. And a lot of our religious identity is also cultural. So it's complicated when somebody says, do I have to convert? So you don't, we say no. The answer is no. But it may be a better question to ask, what have you formerly been worshiping? Were you aware of what it was? What have you been worshiping in your life? To be a serious Unitarian Universalist, there are actually some conversions that it may be necessary to make that are all grounded in our Unitarian and our Universalist theological heritage, which teaches us the nature of humanity and of the divine. There are hundreds of years of theological teaching. So some of the conversions that we may in fact need to make to be faithful members of this community are, we may need to convert from an entirely individualistic approach to survival and success, to a concern for the survival and the thriving, in fact, and the flourishing of all people, and in fact, creation, even at a sacrifice. So that might be a conversion that some folks need to make when we become community. We may have to convert from certainty to flexibility in all things. And this requires something that you have a really hard time with, which is humility. Because it's true, in Protestant traditions, there's a point in every worship service that is a confession of sin. We don't do that. And I miss it. I really do miss it, because it says, recognizing that we screw up and are broken, we therefore affirm, the inherent worth and dignity of all of us, for instance. So we maintain a humble recognition that revelation is not sealed. And we may need to adjust our thinking from what we assume is truth, is a conversion some of us do need to make to be faithful in community. We may have to convert from the consumeristic attitude that our culture teaches us, that trains us to think of all institutions and organizations as things we might join in order to get our own needs met. Convert from that mentality or attitude to a new sense of considering that some institutions, for instance the church, might not be there just to meet our needs, but to equip us to meet our deeper non-materialistic needs to serve and to contribute and to make sacrifices and to get over ourselves in the common parlance, Another conversion that we may need to make, and again, these are ongoing conversions that this is called spiritual practice, that we may need to convert our attitude that spirituality is a natural and easy thing to an attitude that spiritual growth is an important moral commitment that takes daily work and effort. When I think of our UU principles, which you can find, if you're not familiar with them, you can find at the very first pages of your hymnal, it doesn't say we covenant to be spiritual together. It says we covenant to work on spiritual growth. So that's one of the conversions we may need to make. We may need to convert ourselves from a worldview that we're great and fine to a worldview that requires us to pay sometimes uncomfortable attention to how we may be complicit in systems that oppress others. So that's a tough conversion to make, but one that we are asked to do as Unitarian Universalists. We may need to experience a conversion that reveals to us that we are not called to help those in need, but rather to frame our instinct to give more out of a recognition of our own need and vulnerability. We are all needy. And to understand that we may need to receive just as much as we feel obligated to give. And this happens particularly as we become more fragile, sometimes with age, sometimes with infirmity, sometimes because life has handed us some very difficult circumstances that are painful, that lead us to understand neediness and vulnerability. When we have that worldview of we're okay and it's the needy who need our help, then we are not in solidarity. We are not in solidarity with humanity, but feel some sort of noblesse oblige. So I regret really that I've missed an opportunity so many times to answer that question. Well, of course you don't need to convert from another religion, but here are some ways that we would like you to work on a conversion. I was thinking of conversion as that blinding moment of, oh my gosh, that happened, for instance, to St. Paul on the road to Damascus, if you remember your story. He was Saul of Tarsus, persecuting the followers of Jesus, these new weirdos, they were considered real weirdos back in the early Christian era. And he fell off his horse. He had a direct experience of the Spirit of Christ saying, what are you doing? Fell off his horse and he became St. Paul. That doesn't happen for most of us in our most transformative moments. So transformation actually is a better term for what we are actually about here. We are not required to convert, but we are required and asked and called to transform, which is a process. Sometimes it can happen in a blinding flash of grace, but to me, conversion feels like something that happens to me, almost like violent, like, when you fall off your horse, that's kind of shocking. Transformation is a gentler process, something that happens in stages when we are open to it, and so slowly that we can observe it happening, which is a real gift. My favorite story of transformation in community is from the Unitarian Universalist Church, First Unitarian Church in Chicago. And my friend, the Reverend Phyllis Hubble, tells the story this way. James Luther Adams, a Unitarian Universalist theologian and social activist, told her this story. So we're going down a few generations of telling it. This is about a Board of Trustees meeting at First Unitarian Church of Chicago during the civil rights struggle of last century. James Luther Adams was a board member. This particular meeting had been a contentious one, lasting late into the night, and I'm so glad our board meetings don't go that late. The board was discussing whether to recommend to the congregation a bylaw change that would eliminate the racial restrictions on membership. So yes, if you're thinking, what? Yes, UU history involves many of our older churches having racial restrictions on membership. There was one board holdout at Adams's board meeting. The board wanted to present its recommendation to the congregation unanimously. Dr. Adams argued passionately with this holdout, until he was exhausted and frustrated beyond measure. And he finally asked this man, "What do you think the church is for? What does it exist to do?" And after a long pause, the man replied, "The purpose of this church is to change people like me." Shift happens. There is a Greek word, metanoia, that literally means repentance. But over the centuries in the Christian tradition, it came to mean a change in perspective, a change of behaviors that result from having that new perspective. And that's, I think, where the amazing possibility lies, in the behaviors we decide to change or choices we make based on our new wisdom. I think Memorial Day weekend is an important time to think together about metanoia, the transformation that is based in repentance, which means deep moral regret, and the desire to be more whole, to have more integrity. War brings out the most unholy and violent instincts in humans, and it also causes moral injury to those who are asked to fight wars, to those who go in to fight it. I think our prayers for peace have more guts to them when we remember how often we have been brought to wisdom and humility and reverence by a conversion experience. And I wanted to open that up for sharing now, to see if any of you are remembering your own moment or a very important insight that you had that created a conversion experience or a transformation experience for you that led you to more wholeness. I just think that the kind of testimonies that people have are really powerful, and so I just wanted to say if you can briefly share them if you're thinking of one now. I would love to hear that. So, yeah.
I grew up sort of inheriting my mother's low self-esteem. And around my late 20s, early 30s, I got into very, very rigorous meditation. And after months of doing it, and really doing it for a long time, periods of time, a light bulb went off, and it was so powerful, this idea that I was okay just because I breathe. And it was so powerful, it never left me. And the idea of self-esteem, or lack thereof, left for good. And it was really powerful.
Thank you.
About 15 years ago, I was standing at my kitchen sink washing the dishes and looking out the window, and it suddenly came to me that I knew I needed to be a part of creating more safe people in the world for the vulnerable and children to go to if they found themselves in danger of sexual abuse. And it was so sudden, and it was so real, and it was so complete that I went to tell my family, and I came to tell the minister, and it led me eventually to 10 years of training teachers to teach in the Our Whole Lives sexuality curriculum that this denomination has put together, and that was the most important thing I ever did.
I had one of those lifetime shocks, 2 a.m. Monday, this last Monday. I knew growing up that my parents and my father's father, that side of the family, were racist. They were mildly racist in the sense that they were white people that never knew that many African American people. If they had known African American people regularly, they would have been racist, period. I found out, Googling members of my family, my grandfather's brother, who he shut out from his life in the 1950s, not because of this, because of something else. My grandfather's brother, a pioneer radio announcer, I think that's a fair name for him, had fallen on really hard times and blamed people for it. And he made friends with people in the Ku Klux Klan. He recorded anti-Semitic and anti-African American speeches for them, 7 or 8 minutes. And wouldn't you know, some of them are available on YouTube today, which means they will be there forever. And I sat there in the office at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to process this knowledge, which totally horrified me. Talked to my middle son the next day. He had been having some problems of his own with his career, and I said, look, I told him about Uncle Wally and said, look, here's the deal. You and I aren't everything that we want to be at this moment. We are not as successful as we want to be, but you know what? We are not Uncle Wally. And I will say this now. I told him 10 hours ago, I would never have thought of saying this, but thank you, Uncle Wally, for giving us an example of something that we don't want to be. And that, I think, was in the background, deep in the background, when I made up my mind, while still living with my parents, that I was going to be a member of a Unitarian church someday, and I was not going to be like my parents. This stuff, all of it, ends with me. And that's, I don't know. I've had that simmering inside me all week, and thank you very much for listening.
Testify, brother.
Yeah, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
To dovetail on that, Jack, about blame and perhaps my conversion in recent years of something even simpler, rudimentary in me, is knowing I grew up in a family that I love very much, but was really troubled. And the thing that prevailed beyond any values of justice was the value of blame. And so it's easy to be good at blame on a personal, daily level with people we love, people we don't know. And somewhere along the way, I had the gift of challenging myself. If I'm really good at figuring out how people are wrong, I'm going to decide to try to get really good at figuring out how people are right. And it's a wild ride, and I'm glad to be here with all of you and your heart.
Thank you, Vicki. I think the word shift is meaningful to me after listening to you this morning. And I remember when I came here for the first time, some maybe 12, 13 years ago when Van was still our minister, I had come from Mass on Easter Sunday, and it wasn't working. Everybody was reprimanded for not being there all of Lent. And my wife said, you have to try this church. And the first sermon I heard Van give when I walked in was why your hour of congregational worship should make you taller when you go out the door than when you came in. I was almost in tears. I thought, who told him I was coming? And in discussions with Van over the next few weeks where I was really struggling, thankful that there wasn't a cross on the church because I'm sure lightning would have hit it with me in it. And Van listened to me and he said, well, and I'll never forget it with that wonderful Southern accent, he said, it ain't all bad. And the light bulb went off. And it's true. And it's so true of so many things. It ain't all bad. And he said, keep what's working, let go of the rest. And that made it so easy for me to come in here because it wasn't black and white. I've come to the conclusion at my age that gray is a rainbow of colors. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your sharing. We're all like the slave ship captain, John Newton, I think, who during a storm one night had an experience of metanoia out of nowhere and really realized full force that he was operating in an evil system and making his living off of it. Of course, our examples are not that dramatic, but I think that that experience of wow is similar. John Newton left the slave trade and he became a minister. And he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which I think is the most beautiful testament to metanoia ever written. And I think that's why, despite differences in theology, so many people love it. And even staunch humanists of my acquaintance request it for their funeral, even though it says, saved a wretch like me, and sometimes that feels a little too, insulting to our humanity positive theology. We know that wretchedness that can claim us all in parts of our being. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. So what is it that causes this transformation, this metanoia, these conversions? Amazing grace. Metanoia isn't something we can set as a goal. It happens through effort, but mostly when a veil is lifted from our sight at a time we can never anticipate or predict, when our hearts have remained open enough to crack and break, and for wisdom to move in where hardness has been. The purpose of the church is to change people like us. It takes more courage to be part of that process than we may realize. Friends, will you join me in singing Amazing Grace? It's number 205 in your hymnal, but you may know it by heart. And if so, I'll shout out the verses. So let's rise as you are able, please.